Thank you, Therese. Tēnā koutou, hello. First, I want to apologise for the extremely data-heavy content of this presentation. It's what I've been asked to do, but it's going to be pretty dense. Let's first of all just revisit the broad picture that David opened up for us. Where we're at in terms of turnout cross-nationally. This is a selection of countries that are old democracies, continuous since about 1950. They're developed countries. They're the sorts of countries that we might want to compare ourselves with as being the most appropriate ones. And New Zealand's right in the middle. And if that's the case, maybe, as others have suggested, we might not have much to worry about. We're just comfortably average. But is comfortably average good enough for us? So the next figure, again, it's a slightly different version of what you've already seen. But in this case, I've drawn what's called a regression line through it, a trend line, in other words. And what's interesting about doing that is that about 80% of the change in turnout, so we've got turnout plotted from 1945 through to 2011, 80% of the change in turnout can be accounted for statistically simply by the passage of time. Now, of course, that isn't an explanation, but it's an indication of how strong the trend is. It's on what's called an age-eligible base, which means that we're not doing it on a roll base. This is on the basis of those who are eligible to vote by residency and age. Okay, what's interesting about this line is that basically turnout's only gone up for more than 2 successive elections in a row twice. It went up 4 times between 1975 and 1984, and it went up twice in 1993 and 1996. But otherwise, it's just been up, down, and more down than up. So the next question is, of course, how do we explain this decline? Who are the main culprits? And of course, immediately we start talking about young people who apparently are to blame. But again, as others have said, young people have always been less likely to vote than older people. There's not much difference, except that young people now are less likely to vote than young people were 20 years ago. There is this generational shift which is happening, which is actually rather worrying. This next data is age and turnout from 1996 to 2011. 18 to 30s are the red columns, 30 plus are the blue columns. This is as a percentage of the roll, and it's actually taken from a sample from the roll and checked against the marked rolls, which means that it's almost 100% response rate. So there's not a lot of error in that. The numbers are reasonably big. There is just a slight problem in that we probably haven't quite got all of these special voters crossed off. So there's a small amount of error there. On a roll basis, we can see that by 2011, only about half of the 18 to 29s were voting. And if we take it down to the age-eligible population, which we can do by factoring in data on enrolment by age, then it's looking even worse. The proportion of the 18 to 29s voting in 2011 is probably not a lot more than 40%. So if we start thinking about this as something that will continue to ratchet through as this generation gets older, then we are looking at the continuation of the trend that we've just seen. There are various other things that we know about the propensity to vote or not vote, and again, this is simply going over what David was telling us, although with recent New Zealand data, yes, education makes a difference. University degree, you're 7% more likely to vote than someone who has a non-degree qualification. If you left school at 15, you're 7% less likely to vote, and so on and so forth. You're more likely to vote if you live in an urban area. If you have the maximum number of assets. If you have a house, a business, stocks and shares and savings, then you're much more likely to vote than someone who doesn't have any of those, or maybe only one. Income works in pretty much the same way. So again, just reinforcing what David was telling us, people living in a household where the main income earner is a manual or service worker, again, you're less likely to vote. And Asian New Zealanders are much more less likely to vote. Sorry, that's a double negative. They're less likely to vote, even less likely to vote than Maori, which is quite interesting. But being in a Maori electorate also makes you much less likely to vote. So this is stuff that we've known for a long time. Let's get back to this trend of turnout decline. What we've got here is a different way of plotting the data that you saw on the first change over time figure. So again, we've got 1945 through 1946 through to 2011, and we've got ups and downs in turnout around the zero. So turnout up by so much, turnout down by so much, change from the previous election. And what we can see here is that there are more downs than ups, which I guess was pretty obvious from the first figure. What we can do with this data is actually try and model it statistically to try and figure out what's contributing to this in terms of the characteristics of elections. And if we do that, we actually get a model which has a pretty good fit. So the grey line is the predicted turnout on the basis of these characteristics of elections. So what are these characteristics of elections? Well, very simply, they're changes in the vote gap between the National and Labor parties at the current election, the one in question, and the change that took place at the previous election. And those two factors, which are about the closeness of elections, the closeness of the current election and the closeness of the one before, are what drives most of the turnout change from election to election. Left-right policy differences between the two major parties also have a bit of an effect, and one can estimate those from a content analysis of the party manifestos, which a former student of mine, Matthew Gibbons, has done. And also the percentage of new voters coming into the potential electorate at the current election also makes a difference. And that's particularly when interacted with the closeness of the election. So young voters are particularly sensitive to whether or not the election appears to be close between National and Labor. So closeness between the two major parties seems to be very important in terms of shaping perceptions among voters or potential voters. And you can see here, we've got the National Labor gap, again, over the period 1946 to 2011. And you can see that when we get into the 21st century, the gaps between National and Labor have gotten wider. So this is very much helping to drive this turnout trend downwards. David introduced you earlier on to the distinction between life cycle effects, young are less likely to vote, older people are more likely to vote, and generational effects. Here we have generational effects calculated from data from the New Zealand Election Study, in which I'm a principal researcher, which shows the probability of vote between the ages of 25 and 35, where we have enough people in sample to be able to meaningfully model this. And so it's basically between those who began voting before 1996 and those who began voting after 1996. So those who began voting after 1996 are the red line, and they are much less likely to vote. And while they become more likely to vote, as they move towards 35, they don't catch up with the group who began voting before 1996. So this is a very good indication of how these generational effects persist. That's just from 1996 onwards. I've done some other analysis which takes us all the way back to 1993, which took us up to the 2005 election, and again, here are age cohort differences across generations defined by those year periods which indicate when people began voting. And so you can see that compared to those who began voting before 1955, people in these age bands, if you like, these age cohorts have become progressively less likely to vote, although the group who began voting in 1996-72 bounced back a little bit. But what's particularly interesting, of course, is that the big drop is among those who began voting in 1984 and afterwards, up to 1992. I suspect that the group 1993 onwards probably, given that this doesn't include data from 2008, 2011, probably the 1993 and onwards group, if we factored in that data, are at least as bad as those who began voting after 1984. So again, this is the evidence that we've got these generational effects travelling through, and because much of the evidence we get from studies of turnout confirm that turnout is sticky. Early turnout behaviour leaves a footprint. Turnout behaviour is sticky, so if you learn to vote, then you'll continue to vote, but if you learn not to vote, then you'll continue not to vote. What about the Maori electorates? This is just simply plotting turnout in the Maori electorates against overall turnout, and you can see that there is a gap. The gap in the blue line is the 1978 election, where I couldn't get any decent estimate of Maori turnout because basically turnout and the roll for that election just got really badly messed up. But leaving that aside, the big dip in 1975 is also probably also because of the fact that the rolls got a bit messy around that time. But the key point is that there's a gap, and there's always been a gap, and it's maybe gotten a little wider, but I think without actually having done the modelling, which was involved getting age groups factored into an analysis, I suspect that the widening of the gap is simply because the Maori population has become younger more recently, and so we're also getting a youth effect there. Now, a lot of people say when we talk about turnout decline that we shouldn't worry about it because the people who don't vote either don't know or don't care, and in particular they don't know. And if they don't know enough to cast an informed vote, maybe we're better off without them. Now, certainly political knowledge does affect whether or not you vote. And this is simply a figure which shows changes in probability between people with low knowledge, which is estimated by a series of questions that we ask in the NZES, and high knowledge. And there's a probability difference between about 0.6 and 0.85. So knowledge does affect one's confidence in being able to vote, but even with low knowledge, people are still about 60% likely to cast a vote. This is as it was in the 2011 election. So knowledge is not at all the whole story about voting, and indeed, if we try to think about political knowledge as something that might help to explain turnout change, we wouldn't get very far because, one, we don't have enough data about political knowledge in the past. We might perhaps want to infer that have New Zealanders become less knowledgeable about politics over time, and there may be some media critics who might want to develop that argument, but personally I don't think that change in knowledge is anything to do with turnout decline, and so knowledge is not really a big issue. Obviously, when we are trying to understand what's going on with choices about turnout, we want to try to get inside people's heads. So we initially start looking at age and demographics and so on and so forth, but we also want to start asking people questions about their perceptions of voting and how that might affect turnout. in the NZES in 2011, we actually asked the people who said they didn't vote whether it was because they didn't manage to vote or whether it was because they chose not to vote. And it works out about 60% who didn't manage and about 40% who actually chose not to. So we probably need to look a lot more closely at these people because these two groups are going to probably require quite different strategies to be able to perhaps make a difference. And one of the problems with using survey data to study non-voters is that not voting does tend to correlate with not wanting to fill out a rather long questionnaire. So there are limits to what one can do with survey data with non-voters because we get some non-voters, but they're probably the less disconnected non-voters. So there's a lot of research to be done, and it's probably going to be more difficult and cost a lot more money than's currently being thrown into this kind of work. So, okay, so those are... What about attitudes that obviously directly impinge onto how people see the chance of their vote making a difference? Well, we ask a question in the NZES, does voting make a difference to what happens? And there's a range on a 5-point scale between not any difference and a big difference. And what's interesting here is that a lot of people still think that it makes a big difference, which is reasonably encouraging. Those who say not any difference, well, they're about 10%. My vote counts in elections. Do people agree or disagree with that? And here you can see that, well, most people, just under 50%, think that their vote counts, but they don't strongly agree that it counts. They only just agree that it counts. There's only a relatively small minority who think that it counts a lot, which is probably quite reasonable given that what we know about the effect that a single vote can have in an election. So these perceptions do factor into voting choices. That is, the choice to vote or not to vote. And here again we have the probability of vote between those who think that voting doesn't make any difference and those who think it makes a big difference. And what's interesting here is that even if you think voting doesn't make any difference, you're still more than 60% likely to vote. But of course, if you think it makes a big difference, then you're more like almost 80% likely to vote. So one of the problems with some of the surveys that have been done with non-voters in New Zealand is that the surveys only asked non-voters how they perceive the vote. So a non-voter is asked, why didn't you vote? Was it because you didn't think that your vote would make a difference? And of course, many of them say yes. But the point is, quite a lot of voters think that their vote won't make a difference, and they still go out and vote. So these perceptions can tell us something, but again, they're not the whole story. And here again is the same probability difference with respect to those who think that their vote doesn't count and those who think that their vote does count. And again, it's actually quite a bigger difference here. You can see the line is considerably steeper, but basically the same story. Okay, so we know quite a lot about turnout in New Zealand, but we don't know nearly enough. And because many international studies have much more resources to be able to throw into this research, a lot of the theoretical knowledge we have mostly comes from elsewhere. And David has referred to quite a lot of this already. We know that voting is a social act. It's a kind of thing that people do together. And this is why I think the idea that the minister referred to of people going down to the local school on election day together, often the whole family, is an indication of the sort of behaviour that encourages voter turnout. Being embedded in social networks that encourage turnout is something that is really, really important. And if perhaps our society has become a little less cohesive over the last 20 or 30 years perhaps, then this may be one factor. But it's not necessarily the whole story. The problem is that explanations of turnout decline require multiple explanations. But it's because I think that voting is a social act, I'm a little sceptical about proposals for internet voting. I'm not opposed to internet voting, but I don't necessarily think that it's going to make a lot of difference because, of course, if you vote on the internet, it's just you sitting in front of your computer or using your smartphone. I guess you could sort of post something on Facebook to say, hey, I voted, which might have some kind of effect, but I don't think it's quite the same thing. I think it's probably something that will come, but from what we know about turnout on voting where internet voting is being used, it doesn't seem to be a magic bullet. Maybe problems to do with people not leaving home as early as they used to. There's some literature about this. Mobilisation is important, what political parties do, but political parties need resources, and political parties have much fewer members than they used to in the past. And there's also a big debate whether it's habit or whether it's changes in norms and values that are accounting for the generational differences, and I don't have time to go into that. So how can decline be reversed? Well, maybe we can look at one example of when it was reversed in New Zealand in the period 1975 to 1984. We had increasing party memberships. We had the mobilisation of a new generation of voters, party members and political leaders. There was a big generational shift in our political elite at that time, as Colin James has described. New issue dimensions entered politics. Highly competitive elections, very close elections between National and Labour, and polarised politics and divisive leadership. So this then is probably as good a time as any to end the presentation. I think I'm out of time. This reminds us of times with respect to turnout were pretty good, but in other respects perhaps not so good. Thank you.